Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to day 5, episode 5 of our February webinar series, which is all about getting ahead of the growth opportunity in China. We have come to the last day of doing your action plan and your preparation, because my true philosophy is, in order to get ahead of the growth opportunity in China, you must prepare yourself. You need to create system processes in your organization that are going to help you to gain an education and a knowledge level that's going to protect your business as you're moving along in the Chinese market. How this webinar works is we're here to educate you. We're here to teach you. If you've got any questions, this is your time spent. Put it in the chat box. It'll be a first come, first serve principle during the Q&A. So ask any questions. There's no dumb question when it comes to China. From a technical standpoint, if you run into any issues, you just have to log off, log back in. Can't help you further with that. Just know we are recording today's session. And if we run into any technical difficulties, it usually does take about 90 seconds to 2 minutes for me to reboot. And I'll be coming on to finish today's presentation. The webinar is for you if you are either a newbie or a startup to China and you are looking to get an education on how to protect your business, how to protect yourself, considering all of these new opportunities that will be falling on your doorstep. If you are a startup in China and you've already been transacting with China, you've probably been focusing on the core functions of that business that you haven't really thought about going to the next phase of your China journey, which might entail you to have an on-the-ground strategy, on-the-ground business with headcount there. So I'd love to know from you, are you a newbie? Are you a startup? Please do type it into the chat box what you are, so we get a bit of an understanding of who is on here today. Now, just to reiterate the 5 sessions from this week, which has been all about getting ahead of the growth opportunity in China. On Monday, we were talking about preparing yourself on how to save your brand in China. On Tuesday, we were talking about the China Incorporation Blueprint, what key decisions have to be made when you're setting up your entity. Wednesday was all about how to start your business with your Chinese accountant and what you have to do from an accounting perspective. And remember, all of this entails whether you are transacting directly with China or whether you have an entity in China. Okay, it's the same kind of principle. Yesterday, we were talking about how to recruit and hire your first employees. And today, we're going to be talking about how to choose the right people for your China business. Okay, who are the right people for your corporate management? A little bit about myself. I'm the expert for this week. My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I'm a leading expert on inbound investment into China, and I've got over 17 years of experience in corporate services and compliance. 100% of my clients are foreign investors that are going into the market. And how I've helped them is with their pre-investment advisory, strategy development, and moving on to the actual implementation of the types of business models they're looking to develop, and then all the way through to guiding them on the scale and growth of their organizations. If you haven't received a copy of our free complimentary ebook on the 10 biggest mistakes companies make in China, please do email me at christina@woodburnglobal.com. There's been wonderful feedback from people saying that they're learning about what not to do in the market. A lot of these 10 biggest mistakes are mistakes I've personally done and are certainly mistakes that I've seen clients do. So please do take them into account. It's a great resource for leaders that are looking to get into the Chinese market. So the topic for today is how to choose the right people for your corporate management in China. And what we're covering today is case studies, what is the shareholder, the corporate structure, allocating power, and action plan. So setting up a company in China, what roles are in the corporate management, okay? Your action plan is to try to figure out who to appoint for the following roles: the shareholder, the authorized signatory of the shareholder, the board of directors or executive director, the legal rep, the GM, and the supervisor. Now, even if you're not planning on setting up an entity in China, it is still important to define who the key stakeholders are going to be within your organization in relation to the China business, and identifying these key stakeholders and giving them a role that's going to be associated with the decisions they're going to be making, or the decisions they're going to be help making you make when you're going into China. So the issue that we have with this topic is the level of fear that many individuals have in holding these corporate management positions related to the China business. There is a fear that if something goes wrong, that they are held accountable in some shape or form. It will either ruin their career or potentially they'd end up in prison in China. This is our ultimate worst case fear for everybody. We want to eliminate this fear and to tell people that if you've got corporate governance instilled within your organization, and again, this is not just for people that are planning on having an entity in China, it's also for those that are simply transacting in China. If you don't have corporate governance put in place on how to vet partners, on how to vet employees, of course you should have fear. You've got nothing protecting your business. But if you start instilling corporate governance, implementing corporate governance, and that it is followed, then why should you have fear? You're being completely protected. So there's no need to have fear, all right? As long as you follow through with creating this corporate governance within the organization. So who should be the shareholder? Should it be an individual versus a company? I was highlighting this on Tuesday's presentation about setting up. There's no right or wrong answer here. You really need to analyze this with your tax advisors at home about what would be the better option for you. Do you need to have an offshore holding company? Again, you need to instill economic and commercial substance in any holding company in order to be able to benefit from the double taxation agreements. You also have to show proof of effective management. So you need to take all of this into consideration when you're looking at the structures. And honestly, the goal here is not that you create something out of thin air, but you actually talk to your lawyers, your tax advisors at home to know what is the right structure for you as a business owner or for you as the leader bringing the company to China. You can, of course, always use Hong Kong as the shareholder. Historically, this is what has always been used, but we would just not recommend having Hong Kong as the holding company if it is not a transactional entity, meaning that it's not being used to perform transactions in APAC, if there's going to be no headcount on the ground, etc. There's no point in spending money on an entity that's just purely a holding. We're all into cost savings at the moment, and this is just something we don't recommend. So I wanted to turn a little bit onto case studies because I think this truly highlights the pain points that foreign investors have about appointing individuals into the corporate management. I'm saying corporate management because it's about appointing people into the actual entity in China, but this can also be related to the corporate management, i.e. the key stakeholders that are responsible for the China business. So the first case study I have is where we had an SME in Canada incorporating their company in China, and they had an extremely high turnover of corporate management within the first 2 years of operation. All of the individuals they had appointed within the China business had resigned and left. And in the end, they spent over 80,000 RMB in lawyers' fees just to continuously change the internal corporate structure over those 2 years. We want to find people that are stable within the organization. We want to find people that have a long-term vision of growing this China business, whether they're going to be sitting in the HQ or whether they're going to be sitting in the China office. So that would be my conclusion for all of you on this case study. We want stability. We want people that will be staying. You know, in this case, they had 5 or 6 rounds of turnover. It's just insane. You know, if there's one person that's changing every couple of years or 5 years, fine, it happens. But ultimately, you want to have people that are stable within the organization. Case study number 2 is termination of individuals in the corporate structure. So this was an SME in Italy establishing an entity in China. They've had it for a number of years. The appointed legal representative was also the appointed general manager, an Italian guy relocated to China to manage the subsidiary. Now, without properly checking what needs to be done from a corporate governance perspective, the Italian HQ decided to terminate his employment, forgetting that he was actually appointed as a legal rep and as a GM. And when I say appointed, it means he's actually appointed in the government system as being responsible for these 2 roles. Now, documents need to be signed in order to change any role. And And unfortunately, because the termination was ugly, this guy didn't want to sign off on anything. And that was his leverage. Okay. We even went to the extent of going to the government and saying this guy had died because we actually couldn't find him anywhere. And the government asked for his death certificate to prove that he had died. So we want to make sure that we're crossing the T's, dotting the I's, and making sure that before we take any action, we know what the consequences are going to be of that action. Don't do things haphazardly or at the spur of the moment or spontaneously in China. We need to make sure we know what the consequences are going to be for every action so we can prepare ourselves and that we can then have the leverage over those consequences. Case study number 3 is that there's no replacement for individuals within the corporate structure. So this is an SME in the US incorporated with their Chinese subsidiary. The legal representative was the head of the Asia Pacific operations, which was an absolutely logical choice. Everything was perfect until he resigned and decided to move to a new company. The issue here was that the company did not have a replacement for him, and it took them a year and a half to figure out what the replacement was. And it only took a year and a half because this individual threatened to sue them for not removing him as the legal representative of that role. As the legal representative, you are the legal face of the entity in China. And because he was no longer in the business and not knowing what was going on in the business, he didn't want to be liable for any actions that were being done with that company. And in his new role with the new company, he had to fly in and out of China. And he didn't want to get risked by being stopped at immigration for a company he knew nothing about. So it's important that when you are appointing people, you've got a backup plan. In addition, you are honest, and you, even if you can't find a replacement, you at least pay them something and give them a certain knowledge level that they are aware of what's happening in the entity just to protect themselves as well. So in terms of the corporate management structure, and we touched on this again on Tuesday's presentation about the China Incorporation Blueprint, we need to appoint certain people into the corporate management structure. And you will also have to appoint people in your HQ to be responsible for the China business, okay? In this scenario, you've got 2 options. The difference between these 2 diagrams is the board of directors, executive director, where you need to have a minimum of 3 people on the board and just one person appointed as the executive director, okay? Now, questions that you've got to ask yourself in terms of appointing these people is 1, who's going to be the shareholder? But number 2, who is the authorized signatory? Are you going to choose a board of directors, or are you going to have just an executive director so that you can have a simple appointment structure? Who's going to be the appointed legal rep? Who's going to be the appointed GM? And who's going to be the appointed supervisor? We need answers to these questions to understand who will be appointed. And we will need passport copies of all of these individuals as we are incorporating the entity. Now, the criteria of these individuals is important to understand. 1, nobody needs to reside in China, which means that you do not have to appoint somebody that you've newly hired that you barely know into any of these roles. Which is why it's really important to know who the key stakeholders are in the HQ related to the China business, because these key stakeholders, right, are going to be the ones who are going to be fulfilling these roles. They should be responsible for the China business. Don't pick people randomly. When you are doing the appointments, the board of directors, by default, the chairman will also be the legal representative. It's not always a necessity, but it's just generally by default that way, that the chairman of the board will be the legal rep. A member of the board can be the legal rep who can also be the GM. An executive director, which is the other option I was offering, can also be the legal rep and executive and GM. But a supervisor, so I'm going to go back to the diagram. The supervisor can hold no other role except being the supervisor. And the reason for that is that the supervisor is reporting directly to the shareholder on the actions that the board or executive director, the legal rep, GM are doing. And they are basically your corporate governance arm. They are making sure that the company is in compliance and is following PRC regulations. They are supervising the company. So you want somebody who knows, who's going to have insight in that. Now, I wanted to be able, there's a lot of words here, so I'm only really going to take out the key points. The fear that many individuals have is the fact that they do not fully understand the responsibilities that they should be holding when covering these appointments. So I wanted to highlight here what the responsibilities are if you set up a board or you have an executive director. Ultimately, these individuals are working out the corporate strategy and company investment plans. They're looking at creating and working out the annual financial budget and final accounting plans. They're looking at profit distribution, loss recovery plans. They're going to be talking about the working capital of the company and how much that should be, whether it should be increased, decreased. They're going to figure out the numbers in that. They're going to be making decisions on the establishment of the internal management of the company, i.e. the corporate governance. They're going to be appointing and dismissing the GMs that will actually physically be running the company, and the basic rules and policies of the company. So ultimately, whatever is stipulated in the Articles of Association. They have the complete overview around, so the macro view around the company. The liabilities of the legal representative is the fact that the legal rep is responsible for making sure that the company is following the legal compliance side of the business, okay? And ultimately, the legal rep will have the highest level of liability because they will be legally the face to the company. So the legal representative could, and again, this is not to put fear in you, it's just to kind of explain to you how common sense this all is, right? The person is responsible, the legal rep is responsible to make sure there's corporate governance in the company and that corporate governance is being executed, predominantly from a legal perspective, but also from a finance perspective and an operational perspective. If they don't have this corporate governance put in the company, then they can be personally liable and have sanctions and penalties imposed upon them. And if the issue or the offense is related to an actual criminal activity, they will be investigated. And that criminal activity can be anything from conducting illegal operations to practicing fraud, to concealing information and data, withdrawing funds, hiding property, all of that type of stuff. Now, all of this is very similar to Western legislation when running a company. So it really shouldn't be anything new. Obviously, the scary thought is it's China. And if this happens in China, then I'm screwed. Well, you are. But if you don't instill the corporate governance, you're going to be even more screwed. All right. Again, this is all not to instill fear. It's just to make sure the company is running properly. And the role and responsibility of the GM is that this is going to be the person who executes all of the macro plans that have been created. So they're going to execute the feasibility study, the business plan. They're going to make sure that they don't run out of funds and they follow the budget guidelines. They're going to be, basically executing everything in relation to the business, hiring people, firing people, implementing and executing the corporate governance and making sure that it's being abided by. That's what the GM is going to do. The supervisor is, again, somebody who reports to the shareholder and is responsible to make sure that the corporate governance is instilled. They're going to be inspecting the financial affairs of the company, and they're going to be making sure that the board of directors or executive director, as well as any of the other senior managers, are abiding by the Articles of Association of the company, are following the corporate governance procedures, and are following PRC regulations. And they will report to the shareholder should any of those individuals not be taking proper action when it comes down to the Chinese entity. Okay. So that's what the roles and responsibilities are. And like I said, everybody should be taking out a piece of paper and highlighting who the key stakeholders are in the China business and involving them into this corporate management structure. And this should happen regardless of whether you have an entity in China or not, okay? You need to have a list of these decision makers. Now, when you are appointing individuals in these roles, and depending on how long they've been with your organization, Delegating or allocating power will require a certain degree of trust, right? But having said that, let's not rely on the trust. Let's create certain corporate governance measures to mitigate the risks of having these foreign individuals being appointed in the Chinese subsidiary. And there's certain actions you can take in order to mitigate that risk. So for example, when you're allocating power to the legal rep, he's the legal face. He shouldn't be involved in the daily operations. He should be overall involved in the corporate governance and making sure that that corporate governance is instilled. All right. You need to consider that the legal rep does not have to reside in China, but his signature may be required 2 or 3 times a year if changes are going to be made to the corporate structure. And most importantly, if you don't like the legal rep and you're going to terminate him, you might want to have signature sheets readily available so that you don't run into the issue of trying to leverage and get his signature for certain things. Now, for the GM, you don't want to appoint a general manager that you've only known for less than a year, okay? Especially considering that all of these individuals that are appointed are going to be recorded within the government office, which is why I would normally recommend that the roles that you're appointing should be from the head office, should be the key stakeholders. This does not mean that you don't have to hire a local GM who's going to reside in China. You don't have to put him into the corporate management structure. You can still have a business card which says GM. It's just he's not recorded as the individual within the corporate management structure. Of course, you can add him, replace him. That's absolutely fine. But do you really want to go through all that bureaucratic hassle when you've just hired a new GM? You're not sure if they're going to stay, and the probation period might be 6 months to 1 year. All right. Now, the general manager normally, who's residing in China, will have access to company chops licenses. You may want to separate those out, that the company chops are kept maybe with your outsourced provider who's doing the accounts, or to an outsourced lawyer who's going to hold all of these critical documents. Okay. You can always hire third parties who are then custodians to these documents and to these chops. You may want to limit the powers of authority of the general manager, so they might have a cap on how much they can remit. They might have approval processes for that. You might also want to limit and carefully plan out who's going to have access to the bank accounts. So allocating power to use the company chops is very critical because chops basically dictate your business. You sign a company chop, and that means that the contract is affirmed and is real, it's legitimate. So who is going to hold all of these chops? And there are a variety of different chops that you have to take into consideration. There's the company chop, the finance chop, the contract chop, invoice chop, customs chop, and legal rep chop. And you use this all for a variety of different reasons. So the big question is, who's going to hold those chops? Who's going to keep control of them? The biggest tip I can give anybody is whoever is using those chops should keep a logbook of when they've been used, for what have they been used for, and who has authorized it. So the biggest questions you need to ask your management for the China operations is obviously, who or what is making the investment into China? Is it a company or individual? Who are the decision makers? Who are the key stakeholders? Who's going to be the CFO or finance management? Who's going to be authorized to and have access to bank accounts and approve payments and handle the online banking? Who's going to keep control of the company chops and the licenses and authorize all of those? Okay. Now, one thing you all need to consider is that sometimes it also helps to have external companies or individuals be part of your corporate management. So this is something that Woodburn offers, where if you don't necessarily have the right amount of key stakeholders, or the key stakeholders don't want to be put in those types of appointments, is you can appoint us as your supervisor. So that would be me as your supervisor, but we have certain stipulations. I can only be a supervisor of your company if I know what's going on in the company. So our stipulation is that then Woodburn has to manage the accounts of the company. So we have a clear insight into at least the finance aspects of the business. And also the documentation flow for all transactions, etc. We also can act, or I can also act as a non-executive director on the company. It means that I'm not in the corporate management structure. but I am there to guide these individuals who may have fear of holding these roles, to eliminate that fear and give you ideas and brainstorm with you to make sure that you are keeping control of your corporate governance, that it's all been implemented and executed, that the employees are following it. And we can do that by doing health checks or providing other types of services to make sure that's all pointed. But it just means that you have somebody who comes onto the board meetings every so often to listen in about what your plans are and give you advice to make sure you're going the right way and introduce you to your network. So we're not the only providers that offer that. There are many others who do that too, but it's just to give you insight on what else can be offered in terms of these roles. That's the end of today's presentation. I hope that has helped in order for you to make a decision and maybe alleviate a little bit of the fear that is there when you're taking on these roles and these appointments. But I'd love to hear what your biggest takeaway from today was. Use a word, let me know what it is. How you can work with us is we can act as an appointment as a supervisor or as a non-executive director. And we can also advise you on who to appoint within the corporate management structure and understand who the key stakeholders are within your organization. No questions have popped in from the audience today, so I guess everything was very clear. I did speed through that. I know it is Friday, but if you do have any questions or you'd like to have a one-to-one chat, let me know. If you're interested in having a non-executive director or a supervisor for your China business, reach out. You can email me at christina@woodburnglobal.com, and I'd love to have a chat with you about that. That's the end of February webinar series. So we would like to thank you for joining us. If you're interested to see what other sessions we have coming up in March and April, those are already up on our website. You can go to woodburnglobal.com/events. I want to thank everybody for joining me. It's been a pleasure. And if you've got any questions at all, let me know. Take care and goodbye.